think is really interesting about the whole fair trade movement. I was just talking to Bruce beforehand, and many of you will know that he used to be a vet. And I was talking with him and Marvy, and I'm a jewelry designer. Marvy did political science. It sounds like the start of three people went into a pub, Englishman, Italian, and a Scottish jewelry designer. And actually we can go into a pub now, so maybe that is still an option at one day. But I just think that one of the things that shows is that actually all of us have got something to learn from each other, and we're all coming from a slightly different perspective and different walks of life. But what unites us is our desire to see justice and equality and fairness in the world. And I know that not only are we getting the benefit of Bruce's experience today, but the experience of everybody in the room, and also I think all the interactions that Bruce has had over his fair trade journey will have shaped and influenced him and made him rethink things. And I think that we're all rethinking things constantly, reassessing how we do things, how we can do better by people and planet. And so I would just like to say, if when Bruce is going to ask a couple of questions, we're not going to unmute you for the sake of dogs and chickens, but put your answers in the chat section and I'll read them out. And then we will, and anybody who's got any questions throughout, just keep putting them in. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Bruce. Thank you so much for being with us this afternoon. And you have the screen.
Thank you, Laura. So hopefully you should all see the presentation now. Oops, we need to go back. Okay, is that okay, Laura? Can everybody see that?
Yeah,
okay.
That's great, excellent. Is that okay? Everyone else can see? Nod if you can see it. Mel and David, yeah.
That's great.
Cool,
so it's lovely to be with you all, and it was great just seeing some of familiar faces. I saw Rita and Liz there and Howarth, and some names that I know. It's lovely to be here with you all today, albeit virtually. And some of you may remember 3 years ago, I spoke at the BAFS AGM, similar to what I'm talking about today, but about campaigning in relation to our history. And therefore, for those who were there at that AGM, I've got a little revision exercise. Is there anybody who can remember, put it on the chat line, what that is, that symbol? If you put it on a chat line, and then Laura's going to let me know if anybody there has come up with it. I know there's people like Rita who will know what it is anyway. So maybe we should exclude you, Rita and Liz.
There's no chat so far.
Right. Okay. Maybe people are just a bit embarrassed.
Is it a swan?
It is. Well, it could be a swan. Yeah. Okay, but something very specific.
A very specific swan.
Okay.
Anyone else? Come on, Joanna, you must know this.
I know there's people there who do know what it is. And some of you, I'll give you a bit of a clue now before I reveal it, but some of you may have seen this without knowing you've seen it, but it's on the Divine chocolate bar, along with a lot of other symbols. And they're called Adinkra symbols. They're from Ghana. They're called Adinkra symbols, and they all have a meaning. And this one, in the local tree language of Ghana, is called Sankofa. And you'll see it on the bar of Divine chocolate. Next time you get a bar of Divine chocolate, which I hope won't be too long, you look for the symbol. And Sankofa in the local language means return and get it. It means we can learn from our past. It's a bird, it could be a swan, looking back at its tail, meaning we can learn from our past. But the important thing is when we learn from our past that we practice what we call reflective nostalgia. That's where you actually seek for the truth of the past. And you try to find out both the good and the bad. And therefore we can then learn from our mistakes as well as learning from the great achievements and actions of great activists and be inspired by people, what they've done in the past. But we can also, very importantly, learn from the mistakes. And this is as opposed to what's called restorative nostalgia. And that's something which a lot of politicians, dare I say, particularly right-wing politicians, will do to look back at the past and only pick out the good things about our history, and then try to say, let's restore that past. Let's bring it back. Restore the dream that actually never was a dream, because it never really existed like that. An example of this is a former prime minister once referred to returning Britain back to its Victorian values. What does that mean, for goodness sake? You know, Victorian values, sending children up chimneys. You know, do we really want to go back to that world? And it's looking back at things that weren't really like that, and that's not seeking the truth. Another example is the Brexit Leave campaign that was fueled by this restorative nostalgia. So we're not looking at restorative nostalgia today, we're looking at reflective nostalgia. And some time ago, I was asked to give a TEDx talk, and the theme was thinking forward. And my response to that theme was that to move forward progressively, we should not live in the past, but we should learn from, and we can be inspired by it. So what I'd like to do today is to talk a little bit about the history of the British transatlantic slave trade. And for what I believe is really was the birthplace of racism as we see it today, the Black Lives Matter movement that we still have, that's going on today to combat racism. And indeed, it was, to me, the very first time we had a fair trade system that evolved. So here we have the slave trade abolitionists, many of them, some of them not depicted here, but many of them are. And their message was, it is simply immoral that people should be allowed to suffer in order to provide us with luxuries such as tea, coffee, and sugar at a cheap price. And it's important that when we talk about that, sadly, that's still true today. We all know that with our fair trade campaign today. But it's not just true because of contemporary slavery. It's also true because we have a situation today where there's people in West Africa, places like Ghana, the Ivory Coast, where they're growing cocoa for our chocolate. They don't even have access to clean drinking water. And as the abolitionists said, that is quite simply immoral. Maybe a different level to slavery, to know it, but it's quite simply immoral. At this point, by the way, I know that Joanna Pollard's with us, so I'd like to congratulate her on her petition and wish her good luck for meeting with Nestle next Tuesday, where we're talking about West African cocoa farmers. When you look at the slave trade abolitionists, when you look at this, these pictures here, we all think of this guy. This is William Wilberforce. That's the one that most people think of. But it is important to understand there were lots of other people, including former slaves and also women. Even if it was 200 years before the time when women got the vote, women were paramount and vital to the slave trade abolition campaign, doing a lot of the work on the streets, getting petitions signed, and almost inventing the campaigning that we see of today. A lot of it was done by the women on the streets. So it's very important that we recognize that. What I'm going to do today, though, is look at this guy in the top right-hand corner. This guy is a chap called Thomas Clarkson. This is a famous portrait of him sitting alongside his chest. He had a chest full of souvenirs he got from his travels from Africa, and it contained West African textiles and lots of other products made by West African people. And he used it to show that these people were civilized. They were not barbarians. They were civilized people who could create incredible crafts, equal if not better than what we could in Europe at that time. And you could argue that Thomas Clarkson created the very first fair trade system, because after following the American War of Independence with Britain, the British decided that they would free the slaves that were in America, the newly formed United States. I have to be honest, I don't think it was an act of compassion. I think it was more an act of trying to deprive the newly formed United States of its workforce. But they had this idea that they would take these freed slaves up to British-owned Nova Scotia in Canada. They were given land there and then left to fend for themselves. As you can imagine, the conditions were quite harsh and many of them died. And Thomas Clarkson had this idea that he would actually try and take these freed slaves back to their homeland in West Africa. And his younger brother, John, was a Royal Naval officer. And he was given the task of taking those slaves back to West Africa, to a place we now call Freetown. That's why it's called Freetown, in Sierra Leone. And the idea was in Freetown, they would create the Sierra Leone Trading Company, with the idea to send to the world the message to the world that it was actually not only more moral and more ethical but actually made more economic sense to trade with Africans growing produce like sugar and cotton in Africa. It made more economical sense to do that than to ship those people across to America, force them to grow this stuff as slaves, and then ship it all the way back again from across the Atlantic. Sadly, the system failed. There are people who would say today that it didn't fail because the system itself failed, but it failed because the rich and the powerful, who were making so much money out of the trade as it stood, slave trade as it stood, wanted it to fail. So it was a lovely system that failed because the rich and the powerful didn't want it to work, something which I think we can all relate to today, quite sadly. So looking at the slave trade, and although we fight for trade injustice today, it's very difficult, I'm sure you will all appreciate it, if not impossible, not to be complicit with the very thing that we're actually fighting against. And that was very more so true with the slave trade in the 18th century. Everybody was a part of it. And even if it was not only legal, but for most people, it was totally acceptable. The Church of England even owned their own slaves and branded them with hot irons to say that they actually belonged to the church. That's how acceptable it was. But the evil slave trade, as we think of it now, was justified by dehumanizing these African people, referring to them as black cattle, and even suggesting that they were actually better off as slaves. Rather ironically, it was said that slavery would introduce these barbaric African people to Christianity and civilization. Yeah, quite amazing to think of that today. But the abolitionists had the job of showing that these African people were actually human and actually equal to us. We accept that obviously today, but at that time it wasn't so acceptable. And they used this image of a kneeling slave and the words, "Am I not a man and a brother?" to show that this person is your brother, they're equal to you. They also used the similar image of a woman and the words, "Am I not a woman and a sister?" And this was the design, it came from Josiah Wedgwood, who was the great potter, of course, who was also an abolitionist. And today with the Black Lives Movement, many people talk about taking a knee, and they refer to it as coming from Martin Luther King, kneeling to pray during or before his protests. But there's some who would say that taking a knee actually comes from this image way back at the time of the slave trade abolition. Of course, slavery, of course, existed long before the British transatlantic slave trade. But it's important to understand that up to the point of the transatlantic slave trade, slavery was not about colour. You had black slaves, you had white slaves, you had black masters, you had white masters. But the transatlantic slave trade not only took it to a new level and a great efficiency, but they also made it to do with race. So you only had white masters and black slaves, and colour became the thing that defined them. And it was the dehumanization of these African people to justify this new slavery that created this terrible lie that white people were somehow, as the picture suggests, superior to black people. Of course, as the picture also suggests, we all know that is true. But that is really the racism that we see today, that we're still fighting for all these years later. In my mind, that was where it was created. Sometime after that, Darwin came up with his Origin of the Species, and he was ridiculed by some, being depicted as an ape. And there's very same people use this image of an ape and the words, "Am I a man and a brother?" turning the abolitionist slave trade slogan onto its side. And there were people that dismissed, and still are today, people who dismiss this idea that we evolved from apes, but believe that people were created. And what's probably worse, that some people were created more superior than others. It gave this rise to the Atlantean theory, that this mythical place called Atlantis, where there was a superior race. And today, some people are descended from that superior race. That goes on to create these awful experiments where people actually try to show that black brains were different to white brains. We go on to the Nazi Holocaust, apartheid in South Africa, and more recently to the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Nothing short of a modern day lynching. All this time later, but all this has originated from a lie a lie that was created 250 years ago to justify the greed of those slave traders. So now we have the Black Lives Matter movement. And maybe, just maybe, it will put an end to racism as we know it today. At long last, we can see possibly the opportunity to put it to bed. We're seeing mass protests right across the globe. We're seeing removal of statues of people taking a knee at sporting events. And perhaps most importantly, whatever one believes, people are now starting to talk about it. And that's what I want to use this forum for today. It's great to have this opportunity that we can now talk about this racism. Where does it come from? It's so clearly wrong, and yet it still exists today. Now, I never condone violence, but I fully understand the frustration and anger that led to the destruction of the William Colston statue, as we see here in Bristol. I can only imagine what it must have felt like to be a person to walk past that statue and to see a statue of a man who may have been responsible for the suffering and the murder of your ancestors, and yet see them depicted as one of the most virtuous and wise sons of their city. So I can understand what's actually happened. And there were many, many peaceful attempts to have that statue removed, to have it amended. Perhaps inevitably and perhaps understandably, when peaceful attempts are ignored, it leads to violence. That's something which I feel politicians never seem to learn, never seem to understand. So I do understand what led to the destruction of the statue in Bristol. But where do we stop? Here on the left, we have the statue of Churchill. Now, I have to be honest, I'm not a great fan of Churchill. I certainly would not depict him as one of the greatest Britons that ever lived. But there can be no doubt that he was responsible for great achievement during World War II. And some would say that is worthy of a statue. Yes, he was a racist. But should that take away the achievement that he had? I'm putting that as a question to you, not as a statement. In the centre here, we have the statue of William Wilberforce, the great abolitionist. But he was reported to have said that the eradication of Hinduism in India was his greatest mission, even greater than the abolition of slave trade itself. It was also reported to be his idea to put pig flat on the ammunition cartridges of the British Army, so that when Hindus were forced to break into the cartridge, they would have to actually take the pig flat in. That was the action that reportedly led to the mutiny, the Indian Mutiny, or as India would call it, the War of Independence. So we could say that Wilberforce was a racist. He took racist action. But nobody surely would suggest we remove the statue of William Wilberforce in whole, or would they? On the right here, we have Robert Peel, whose father was a vocal opponent of the abolition of slavery because it threatened his fortune in the cotton trade. Should we target his statue? I have to admit my ancestors were Yorkshire mill owners. And I know for a fact they committed terrible deeds, chaining young children to the mills and leaving them there even when the mills were burnt. But should I be blamed for that? Are we all to be held responsible for the deeds of our ancestors? The truth is that we've all benefited in some way from the wealth created from slavery, in this country at least, in Britain. And the chances are our ancestors were at the very least complicit with it, if not more involved. It has been suggested recently that the Black Lives Matter movement and the taking down of statues is erasing our history. But in my view, the Black Lives Matter movement is actually making history. It's a part of history. And the removal of those statues is a part of that process. We've seen it many times before in the past with the Reformation or whatever. That becomes history itself. And the truth is that history is often distorted, and attempts have even been made to erase it. But in my view, it's not so much activists like those people in Bristol who've taken down the statue who are the main perpetrator of erasing history. It's actually the establishment themselves. And I give to you here an example of Operation Legacy, when evidence of the atrocities committed during the British Empire were either destroyed or stored secretly, believe it or not, in Milton Keynes, of all places. And it's been said that only Kenya and Malta are the only two countries ever to have been successful through a trial in actually accessing those files. Kenya, it's quite clear, it's because of the Mau Mau uprising and the way that prisoners were treated to expose that evidence. I'm not quite sure what Malta was trying to show. So the legacy of the British Empire is that to leave many Britons leaving many Britons with what I call a superiority complex. Whether they even recognize it in themselves or not, there are many people that I've come across in my life who actually believe somehow British people and Britain itself is superior to the rest of the world. That is a sort of nationalistic attitude that has gone to fueling Brexit, as well as many other things. I'm now very proud to be involved with a link that we have with our friends in a cocoa farming community of New Koforidia in Ghana. It's now Africa's first fair trade town. And I remember once when we were talking about linking, I heard an African person actually say to the audience, the problem with links between a rich country and a much poorer one is that the people in the poor country are too humble to feel they have anything to give. And the people in the rich country are too proud to know how to receive. And we said with our link, that was something we wanted to address, bring back that balance of pride and humility. It's interesting to note when I asked our local council to support our link, their response was, what can people in a place like Ghana possibly offer people in a place like Garstan? My immediate answer to that was, amongst other things, was humility. What we're seeing now with the Black Lives Matter movement today is a cultural revolution that's sweeping right across the globe. And if this should lead to the end of racism as we know it, or at least to the point where racism is no longer the norm or institutionalized or accepted by society, then surely the removal of a few statues here and there may be a price that's worth paying. We in Britain particularly all have to face up to the fact that we are rich today because other people are poor. And that's not only true because of our history of colonialism and slavery, but it's also true because of trade injustice today, that we're still keeping people in poverty in order to keep us wealthy. And the response to this, and the response that we ask for when we give our workshops in schools to the children, we're not wanting you to feel guilty or to feel shame or even to apologize for those deeds. But what is really important is that we recognize and acknowledge the truth. We acknowledge that it happened and we don't try to cover it up with restorative nostalgia. And then, and only then, can we go forward to a better world where we can look at changing the injustices of today that are a legacy of that terrible past. Tackling racism now with the Black Lives Matter movement is a good example of that, as indeed is fair trade, as a chance to actually one vehicle to actually challenge that injustice that we're seeing today, which in my view is a direct legacy of the colonialism, the slavery, that difference in power, that dehumanization of Africans, this idea that we are better than they are. And although slavery was more than acceptable at the time, it's clearly wrong today. And I'd like to think that in the future, people will look back at our actions today, many of which are quite legal and are quite acceptable, but maybe in the future, they will look back at them differently than we do today. Black lives do matter. Thank you very much.
Oh my goodness, Bruce, thank you so much. That was really moving, super interesting, and yeah, I'm just so helpful to contextualize what is happening at the moment. Did anybody have any questions? No, there aren't actually any in the chat at the moment, unless I'm not seeing something. So I'm maybe going to suggest, Marvi, should we unmute people, and then people can, if we unmute everybody, and then people can put their hands up if they've got a question? Or you don't have to have a question, you could have a comment or a response, or So I feel like I should be clapping from everybody's point of view, Bruce, sorry, because nobody else can hear. Oh, look, we've got virtual claps. I can't work out how to do that. That's beyond me. Did anybody have a question they wanted to ask? I've kind of got I've got everybody on 2 screens, so if people could put up their hands while we try and unmute everyone.
There is no an unmute, so that everybody who wants to ask a question can unmute.
You can unmute yourselves?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Amazing. Sorry, I'm asking to do the impossible, clearly, because I have absolutely no idea how to use technology. I'm wondering whether maybe we stop streaming live now, and then it's a bit less intimidating.